Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is part two of the nervous system. We're going to talk about the central nervous system. And we'll be covering interneurons first, and then we're going to look at the brain structure and behavioral functions, including the hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain, and cerebral cortex. So first, I just like to do a quick review and video just to, get us warmed up for this for the next 15 minutes or so. So let's take a look at this one.
Today, we will talk about an organ that rules all of our body, and that is our brain. As it is the most sensitive organ, our brain is kept inside a bony covering called skull. From doing physical activity to solving logical problems, from dealing with emotions and feeling to creativity, the brain is responsible for all. Therefore, it never sleeps. Our brain can be divided into three main parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and brainstem. Cerebrum is the largest part of brain, which can be further divided into right and left halves, called hemisphere. Each cerebral hemisphere has four lobes, namely frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Each lobe performs different functions. Cerebellum is responsible for movement and coordination. It gives you sense of balance and thus prevents you from falling down. Brainstem includes midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. It controls your body's involuntary actions, like breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. Brain comes under a system called nervous system. Structurally, nervous system is classified into two types: central nervous system, CNS, and peripheral nervous system, PNS. The central nervous system comprises of the brain and spinal cord. The spinal cord is the bridge that connects the brain to peripheral nervous system. It starts from medulla oblongata and stretches to lumbar region of the spine or vertebral column. The peripheral nervous system is a network of nerves spread across our body. Think of peripheral nervous system as a network of highway that connects the body with central nervous system. This highway has two-way traffic. Let's see how. When you hold a hot cup of coffee, sensory neurons in your hand transmit signal to brain through sensory neurons, also called afferent neurons, that the cup is hot. Your brain processes that information and send response through motor neurons, known as efferent neurons, that you must put that cup back. PNS consists of total 43 pairs of nerve, among which 12 originate in brain, named as cranial nerves, and 31 originate from spinal cord, hence called as spinal nerves. Here, you hear the word neuron. Neuron is the basic unit of nervous system. It is the nerve cell which transmit electrical signals to brain. A neuron has three parts: dendrites, soma or cell body, and axon. Dendrites serve as input device for neuron because it receives input from other nerve cells. Soma or cell body of neuron contains nucleus. Axons serve as output device from where it transmit electrical response to other neurons. I hope this helps you in understanding nervous system.
Okay, so everyone's warmed up. You remember everything from the first part of the chapter? Perfect. So there's three types of neurons that carry messages, right, to and from the body to the brain and the brain and back. So in that video, you saw when the man picked up the coffee and it was hot, and then he put it back down, right? So sensory neurons carry input messages from the sense organs to the spinal cord and to the brain. So that gives the message that it's hot, it goes to the brain. Motor neurons transmit output impulses from the brain to your hand and puts down the coffee, right? So we covered these two earlier. We talked about these. And I got a picture here. I wanted to show you the difference. The axon that we looked at before was a motor neuron, right? Because the cell body and the dendrites were at the top with the long axon. And then to the far right, see, you've got the sensory neuron. It looks a little bit different. The cell body's in a different place. It just so looks a little bit different. So in this part of the chapter, we're introducing this interneuron. So this part's new. So what does the interneuron do? When the message goes from your hand up the sensory neuron to your brain, and then it goes from your brain to the motor neurons, put that down. The decision that's between those two, that's in your brain, that processes the two of those things to make that decision, that is called the interneuron. So let's just go back here. Sensory neurons and motor neurons are found throughout the body in the peripheral nervous system. Okay? The interneurons are found only in the brain and spinal cord. They are exclusively in the CNS. They link the input and the output functions. Okay, there's over 100 billion of these. They perform the connective or associative functions within the nervous system, so they're combining everything. And the activity of the interneurons make it possible for the complexity of our higher mental functions, emotions, and behavioral capabilities. So it really links everything together. Okay. The other thing is it links, like for example, it links if you're listening to, say, a song. Like everybody, you've had it where you listen to a song, and all of a sudden you get this flash memory of where you heard it the first time, or maybe some crazy thing you were doing at the time. That is involved. The interneurons are involved in that. They're linking the sensory input with memories. So that's one example of how that works. So this chart is in your book. I'm using this sort of as a frame because there's so much, there's a lot of information in this chapter. There is. So I've actually put a copy of this in the resource folder. Suggestion, if it were me, I would probably, I would print it because I like to just, have something to hold on to and write notes on. I would print it and I would just write down the main function of each of these things, right? And then, sort of a visual to accompany your studying. But anyways, so the first thing we're going to look at is the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, okay? The somatic, and the autonomic. The somatic has the sensory neurons and the motor neurons that we just discussed. And the autonomic nervous systems, it regulates the bodily functions, okay? The internal environment, including heart rate, digestion. There's two subsystems that affect those organs and functions in opposite ways, okay? One is the sympathetic nervous system, which arouses the flight or fight. We'll get into total unit. Total unit of arousal mobilizes the body to manage a stressful situation. So what that means is the sympathetic nervous system, it has like packages of responses. So when you're frightened, it's not just that your heart rate goes up, right? Your heart rate goes up, your digestion slows down, your pupils enlarge. I mean, there's a whole system of responses that go together to handle that situation. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, it slows down the body process, right? But it targets specific organs and certain processes. It doesn't do it as a total unit. It will slow down your breathing, and when that slows down, it might, fight or flight response, right? The parasympathetic system works to bring your body back to normal. Okay, so we'll go take a look at the next chart here. So in the fight or flight response, everything speeds up. Your pupils dilate, your bronchi, they increase to let in more air. Your heart rate increases. It inhibits activity in the stomach, and it contracts blood vessels. So once the situation is resolved, then the parasympathetic system takes over and returns everything to normal. So it constricts the bronchi, it slows your heartbeat, it dilates vessels, and then also starts to stimulate activity again in the stomach. Basically, the two systems, they work together to maintain the equilibrium of, within the body. So that's the peripheral nervous system, a general overview of the different parts and how they work together. Okay, so this next section, we're going to look at the central nervous system. There's quite a few more parts, as you can see. It looks a little overwhelming at first, but like I said, I think try to remember the main function or functions of each. I've also included what happens if those areas are damaged um, in this recording. I think that sort of kind of helps to give examples and help you remember the functions of each. Okay. So the central nervous system is comprised of two main parts, as you know, the brain and the spinal cord. So let's cover the spinal cord first. That one's fairly simple, and then we'll dive into the brain. So most nerves enter and leave through the spinal cord, between the brain and the body, right? It's protected by vertebrae that surround the spinal cord. Move this down a little bit. Sorry. Bam. And the primary function of the spinal cord is to carry signals between the brain and the body. So basically, the spinal cord is the highway for communication between the body and the brain. When the spinal cord is injured or damaged in some way, the exchange of that information is disrupted. And depending on where the damage is to the spinal cord, that would result in damage or paralysis of different parts. Sure. I just found a little bit more information here, like to show you the structure with the gray unmyelinated neurons, right? And then the outer portion has the white myelinated neurons. Okay. You can see how it's protected there. You don't need to know all of these pieces, okay? I'm just showing you the basic structure because the one that I saw um, that was in the text didn't have quite as much detail. You also hear, like if you're watching like movies and on doctor shows or whatnot, and they talk about when somebody has um, a spinal cord injury, and they say, oh, the injury is in lumbar 5 or thoracic 3, right? So what they're talking about is the spinal cord is broken up into 5 different areas. Most of them are going to say 4, actually. They don't count that 5th one. So you've got the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, the sacrum. Those are the 4 main ones that you're going to hear. So unlike other parts of your body, the spinal cord does not have the ability to repair itself if it's damaged. If there is damage to the spinal cord, typically that's from like a trauma, loss of normal blood supply, or compression from, say, like a tumor or an infection or whatnot. But whatever damage that's caused to the spinal cord is permanent. Okay, so the next section is about the brain. Okay, now these are facts that are from the textbook. I thought I'd review some of them. The brain is 1.4 kilograms of protein, fat, and fluid. It is the most active energy consumer of all of your body organs. Okay, so although it only accounts for about 2% of your body weight, it consumes 20% of the oxygen that you use in a resting state. Your brain never rests. Okay, the rate of energy metabolism is relatively stable and constant day and night. It is the receptor for all of the information that comes in through our senses from the environment. Sight, smell, touch, taste, hearing, and it processes all of those experiences. It often receives more than one piece of information from each sense at the same time. right? So it will have the sight, maybe sight, smell, and hearing all at one time, and it's responsible for assembling those impulses and messages in a way that makes sense, in a way that it can react to them. It controls thought, memory, speech, movement, and movement of the body and functions of the organs. So the four main areas of the brain is the hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain, and cerebral cortex. We're going to cover each of those. Some areas, like the forebrain, have quite a few more structures than others, but I'm hoping that we can break it down a little bit for you and simplify it. So we're going to start with the hindbrain. You can see that I've circled it there for you, right there in purple. Okay, it's the lowest and most primitive level of the brain. So it controls the basic physiological functions, um, heart rates, respiration, breathing, movement. So all animals have this, right? All animals have this. It consists of the medulla, the cerebellum, and the pons. So the medulla is responsible for heart rate and respiration. It's the thoroughfare for sensory information, and neurons cross over the medulla into the pons and the cerebrum. The pons that are also just slightly above the medulla there. Okay, that is involved in sleep and arousal, um, dreaming, respiration, and the cerebellum over just on the right there. That coordinates fine muscle movement, balance, learning, and memory. Okay, so that's the hindbrain, the pink piece at the bottom, finished. Now we're going to move up into the midbrain, which is the green structure in the drawing there. Okay, the midbrain contains clusters of sensory and motor neurons. It's associated with vision, hearing, motor control, sleep and wake cycles, alertness, and temperature regulation. It's a very important relay center for the visual and the auditory systems. Okay, so nerve impulses from the eyes and the ears are organized in the midbrain and sent out to the forebrain structures involved in visual and auditory perception. It contains the motor neurons that control eye movement. So, for example, if you see a movement out of the corner of your eye, it's your midbrain that causes your eyes to swing towards that source of movement to identify it. Damage to the midbrain results in various movement disorders, difficulty with vision and hearing, and trouble with memory. Because the midbrain houses the hypothalamus, damage could impair biological drives, such as eating, aggression, and sexual behavior. Okay, next is the reticular formation. It is made up of nerve cells and nerve fibers. It does start, you can see the turquoise piece down there. Okay, it does start down in the brainstem and projects up. It receives data input from most of the sensory organs of the body and sends the information to the higher regions of the brain. So what's important to remember for reticular formation is that it regulates levels of consciousness, alertness, respiration, blood pressure, skeletal tone, and heart rate. So what happens if the reticular formation gets damaged? It can cause persistent unconsciousness, coma, and death. Okay, so now we move on to the forebrain. The forebrain houses many different structures, including the thalamus and the basal ganglia. The thalamus has multiple functions. It acts as a relay station, right? So it routes sensory information to the appropriate place. So the visual goes to the visual centers, auditory goes to the auditory centers. Yeah, so just remembering the thalamus is as like the relay station for all of the sensory input that comes from the environment into the brain and organizes where that goes. Okay, basal ganglia. The basal ganglia has 5 distinct structures around the thalamus. Sorry, it is 5 distinct structures around the thalamus. And all together, those 5 things are called the basal ganglia. So that's critical for voluntary muscle movement, reaching out to grab coffee, for example. And damage to this area includes problems controlling speech, like I sometimes have in these videos, movement, posture, whatnot. So, one example of when there's damage to the basal ganglia is Parkinson's, right? So, the basal ganglia are constantly supplied with dopamine from the surrounding neurons. So, when those neurons are damaged, and so they're no longer supplying the dopamine to the basal ganglia, those basal ganglia die. And that's what happens with Parkinson's. Is as you see, they start having more and more difficulty with movement and controlling muscle. Okay, more centers located in the forebrain include the hypothalamus. The major role of the hypothalamus is controlling biological drives. Its connection with the pituitary gland that controls hormones, sexual behavior, eating, drinking, aggression, emotion. Damage can disrupt all of these behaviors. Okay, it's one of the main centers in the brain. So pay attention to this one. Also, the hippocampus. It is involved in forming and retrieving memories. Basically, you can remember the hippocampus is all about memories. So if it's damaged, it affects our ability to form not only new memories, but spatial memory. Spatial memory is remembering locations and spatial orientation. So basically, that's your ability to know where you are in relation to other things. So, for example, right now, if I were to say to you, where are you in relation to the closest Starbucks, for example? Okay, you can sort of imagine where the Starbucks is and where you are spatially in relation to that. Okay, so the ability to do that um, operates within the hippocampus. The amygdala is a component of the limbic system, and it plays an important role in emotion and behavior, especially those linked to aggression and fear. It produces emotional responses sort of without the brain knowing. So it sort of elicits the feeling of fear or aggression without actually having to go through the process throughout the brain. If the amygdala is damaged, there have been some case studies, right, that have demonstrated that a damaged amygdala impairs memory for emotional events. It also sort of it impairs the processing of certain of emotional expressions. Also, it impairs your ability to read the emotions of others, which can really affect people in their ability for social interactions and functioning with other people in groups and in any sort of social way. And finally, the cerebral cortex, which is known as the crown of the brain. Okay, so the cerebral cortex has 4 lobes: the frontal, parietal, occipital, and the temporal lobe. I found you a better visual for that. Most of those areas are covered in the chapter. So Broca's area there, you can see it's got the speech formation there, and Wernicke's area, this speech understanding, and then just the different parts that you've studied. So that's a good study tool there. And next I wanted to find a little video, break this up again a little bit so you don't have to listen to me talk for the entire time. So I found a really good video on the functions of the cerebral cortex.
What I've drawn for you here is the human brain, and this is what you would see if you were looking at someone and they were standing in profile, or if they were standing sideways in front of you. So this would be the front of their head. So their eyes and their nose and mouth would be located down here. This would be the back of their head. And this would be the top. And then down here would be the bottom. And we refer to this area, this big one right here, which is the first thing that you would see if you were just looking at the outer portion of the brain. We call this the cerebral cortex. And you might notice something about the cerebral cortex right away, which is that it looks kind of wrinkly. And it actually is. Rather than having a smooth surface, it actually has a ton of bumps and folds. And this is actually extremely useful because it allows the cerebral cortex to have greater surface area. It allows it to have room for more neurons. It gives it an increased cellular mass. We usually split the cerebral cortex up into 4 different hemispheres. The first is the frontal lobe, which I'm shading in blue right here. The next area is the parietal lobe, which is back here towards the top and the back end. We also have the occipital lobe, which I'm going to color in pink. And then finally we have the temporal lobe, which I'll draw in violet right here. The frontal lobe is comprised of 2 main regions. Those include the motor strip or the motor cortex, as well as the prefrontal cortex. The motor cortex or the motor strip is responsible for our body movements. In fact, if you could peel back someone's skull and electrically stimulate different areas of the motor cortex, you could make someone's hand twitch or their leg move just by stimulating that area on their brain. The frontal lobe also contains the prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of the brain that's responsible for what we refer to as executive functions. Things like thinking and problem solving all take place in the prefrontal cortex. Not only that, but it also helps to supervise and direct all of the other areas of our brain. Another part of the frontal lobe that's worth mentioning is referred to as Broca's area. And this is a part of the brain that's associated with speech production. Let's move on to this yellowish orange portion here, which we said was the parietal lobe. And this part of the cerebral cortex is also important for a number of different tasks. One important part of the parietal lobe is the somatosensory cortex. And this is the part of your brain that's associated with feeling. And by that, I don't mean emotional feeling. What I actually mean is that this part of the brain receives information from all over your body about touch and pressure and temperature and pain. So the motor cortex would help us reach forward and grab a cup of coffee, but the somatosensory cortex is what would allow us to feel the pressure of that coffee cup or tell us how hot it is. And you might be thinking to yourself that these 2 things seem like they're intimately related, and they are. In fact, even though we say that they're in different lobes of the brain, they're actually right next to each other. So this side of the brain to this side of the crevice within the frontal lobe is the motor cortex. And right next to it, in the parietal portion towards the back, is the somatosensory cortex. And together they can be thought about as the sensory motor cortex. Our parietal lobe is also responsible for spatial processing or spatial manipulation. And by that I mean that it helps you orient yourself in 3-dimensional space. But this part of the brain doesn't only help us understand where we are in space, but it helps us to understand the space around us more generally. For example, if I wanted to reach out and grab a cup of coffee that's in front of me, I could use my prefrontal cortex to plan the movement, and my motor cortex to complete that movement. But I also need my parietal cortex to tell me where that coffee cup is in front of me. And without that, I wouldn't actually be able to reach out and pick it up. Other things like knowing how to navigate around your house or your town, that's also what we mean when we talk about spatial manipulation or spatial processing. Our occipital lobe, which is in the back of our brain, is responsible for things related to vision. We may see with our eyes that are in the front of our head, but after collecting that information from the world around us, that information actually gets transported all the way to the back of our brain for processing. So let's put vision right here. Another term that you might hear in association with the occipital lobe is the term striate cortex. And this simply refers to the fact that if you looked at the occipital lobe under the microscope, if you looked at those cells, that they would appear striped or striated. The last lobe of the brain is the temporal cortex, and that's in violet. And this is the part of your brain that's responsible for auditory processing. As was the case with vision in our occipital lobe, information comes in through our ears, but it is processed in our brain, in our temporal cortex. Another important area in the temporal cortex is what's referred to as Wernicke's area. And when we talked about the frontal cortex, we talked about Broca's area, which we said was responsible for speech production. Well, Wernicke's area is responsible for language reception and language comprehension. Before I end this video, I just want to take a moment to point out that the different lobes of the brain do a lot more than just the things that I've listed here. However, in general, these are the things that you should think about whenever you think about the different lobes of the brain.
Okay, so that covers the 4 different. Sorry, let me just run back here. I should have had a summary slide right there for you. So that covers the 4 main brain structures, right? And their behavioral functions. So we talked about the hindbrain, the midbrain, the forebrain, and the cerebral cortex. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is plasticity in the brain. So neuroplasticity, it's about the ability of neurons to be able to change and reorganize and restructure themselves as a result of experiences with the environment, right? So neural changes occur every time we learn something new. So, for example, I have here learning to play the piano, changes in structure of the cells in the nervous system that underline the motor skills. So there'll be changes in those as we learn new things. The role of experience in the environment. Sorry, let's jump over and talk about the 2 types of brain plasticity. So there's structural plasticity and there's functional plasticity. Right? So structural plasticity, that's about the brains and the neurons, their ability to change their physical structure, their actual structure. Whereas functional plasticity, that is about when one area of the brain is damaged, say in a car accident, right? And there's certain neurons that were damaged, it's over time other neurons in that area of the brain change and take over the function of the dead neurons, right? For example, if some of the neurons that were emitting neurotransmitters for a certain function that was needed, and then it dies, other neurons around it may change their shape, or they may actually start producing more of that neurotransmitter, making up for the dead ones. The role of environment, of the environment and experience. So alcohol can disrupt brain development, which can result in mental and behavioral damage. The one thing that we know is that being in a stimulating environment can increase neural plasticity. Okay, so the more you're learning, the more you're experiencing, and the more that the neurons are growing and changing and growing in their structure, it can actually grow new dendritic. Excuse my inability to speak right now. It grows more branches, right? It enhances the neural activity, increases the cerebral blood flow, and you have healthier white matter, right? So a little bit, it's like the old use it or lose it saying, right? So when you get older, that's why it's good for people when they're older is to keep involved and keep doing things and doing puzzles and say doing Sudoku and doing different things that are stimulating their brain and having learning experiences to keep that plasticity, to keep that going. All right, so almost at the end here. And I jumped a little bit ahead on that last slide. So then the text talks about early in life. So a 1 to 2 year old has 50% more synapses than a mature adult. It gives an example of there's a story about a child who recovered from a brain injury. Younger people will recover from brain injuries more quickly and completely than adults, um, simply because their neurons are still very active and and they're still growing. Unused weaker synapses deteriorate with age, and the brain loses some of its plasticity. Right, so that's what we talked a little bit about. Keeping them going, um, and keeping them functioning. Lack of stimulation will result in cell death. The last question, can you improve your neuroplasticity? Again, the answer is yes. Continued intellectual stimulation and activity. Another key one is getting enough sleep. The brain needs to reset. Um, And when we get into a chapter about memory and learning, you you will you're going to learn that sleep plays a major function on everything that you learned that day and all of the studying that you did. When you go to sleep, a lot has to do with the storage of that memory, um, and the storage of the learning. Okay, so that is the end of the structural organization of the nervous system. Okay, we talked about the peripheral nervous system. That was the shorter piece at the beginning. Then we talked about the central nervous system. That one's a little bit more involved. And we covered all of these different organs and centers in the CNS. Again, I think it's a good idea to perhaps print this off or however you do that now, and just write the main functions for each of them, right? Um, yeah, so you'll find that chart. It's in resources, and you can do what you will with that. And that is the end. That is the end of chapter 3. I hope you enjoyed that. I know it is a little bit more intense than the other chapters we've done so far. I think if you watch the videos a few times over and maybe have that chart handy, and sort of refer to that, then it will all sink in and you'll be good. All right, so we will see you in chapter 4.